So the Industrial Revolution changes the basic way that goods are made and the basic way that people get around, or that even goods get around. But it has a much more profound impact than that. It's also social, and it affects society to a great degree. And so one of the major changes that takes place is the rise of the class system and rapid urbanization. These factories, or the rise of the factory system that was made possible by the invention of the steam engine, is going to center production in certain areas. And so people move to cities in order to find jobs in factories. Now, these cities are nothing like cities of the past. You have dramatic population growth over the course of the 1700s, 1800s, and all the way up until the 1900s. And so this rapid urbanization and people flocking to cities is going to create a lot of problems in terms of living conditions. These cities are unprepared to handle the massive influx of individuals. You don't have adequate sewage lines, and so you have open sewage in many of the streets. No indoor plumbing exists. People simply just throw their sewage out the window or out in the streets. No system of trash collection. People bring their animals into the cities. You have pollution as a result of the steam engines burning off massive amounts of coal, contaminated water. Disease spreads very rapidly in these cities. In fact, your life expectancy in some of these cities was actually lower than in the countryside. People don't have a very good understanding about disease, and people don't understand, not yet anyways, they're getting there, but not yet, that you don't drink from the water that the local butcher is dumping all the excess animal product in. So it's a very, very unpleasant situation living in those areas. To add on top of it, crime, poverty, desperation, and no building codes. So houses are often built right next to factories, and factories are right next to the daycare, and the daycare is right next to the church, and the church is right next to the slaughterhouse. So it's just miserable conditions in these areas, and it's going to present some problems, and it's going to take a little while for people to begin to try and figure out how to solve these problems. Another thing that changes dramatically are working conditions, the type of work that people do. And so it's easy to be nostalgic about the past when people were mostly farmers. The transformation is going from a farmer to the factory work. Now, the thing was, on the farm, things were especially tough. It was not easy being a farmer. And every single winter, most farmers, most people, risked starvation. Every winter, you worked from sun up till sundown. So we can't be too nostalgic about the past, but the working conditions in the factories were horrible, with all that being said. So because mechanization was doing most of the work, typically your job in the factory was very repetitive. It was psychologically dull, to say the least. It required very little skill, so unskilled labor. Everybody could essentially do that. With that, you see the rise of child labor. You see women in the workplace. You see men in the workplace. Everybody is essentially able to push a button for 8 hours. I take that back. Everybody is essentially able to push a button for 16 hours a day, because there were very, very long hours. So it was long hours, repetitive tasks. You worked by the factory clock. One of the things that the Industrial Revolution allowed for was overcoming natural barriers. So on the farm, you worked when the sun came out, and you stopped working when the sun went down. And during the fall would be harvest. During the winter, you didn't do anything. During the spring, you planted. So nature dictated how you worked. With the steam engine, that doesn't matter. And so what dictates your work life, and really your whole life, is the clock. And the Industrial Revolution is when people became hostage to the clock. And so you worked by the factory whistle, and it didn't matter if it was cold or hot or summer or winter or whatever it was. Now, these working conditions were repetitive, tough, you were a slave to the clock, and also very dangerous. Industrial accidents were very high. And because there was a large labor source, if you got injured on the job, you were essentially out of work. There was very little recourse for workers at this time. There were no wage laws or laws that limited hours, none of those protections. Families were separated On the farm, you worked with your family. Husbands and wives and children worked together and lived together. The Industrial Revolution will separate families during the day, and because working hours are so long, 12, 16, 14-hour days, families are going to be separated for an extended period of time. It also has another downside outside of these industrial cities, and that is the rise of slavery, especially cotton slavery, because most of these industries are first focused on textiles. So, we can add that to the list. And it also begins to change society, especially for the middle class. Now, we have to make a distinction between the working class and the middle class. The working class are the factory workers. The middle class are sort of the managerial classes. It's the rise of new industries like retail, and, clerks and cashiers and stuff like that. And so what you found in the Industrial Revolution was this idea called the cult of domesticity, which separates the roles that men and women play in society. It says that men are supposed to be in the public life and women are supposed to be in the private or domestic life. Now, these ideas are going to be challenged by Mary Wollstonecraft, who writes A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and she's going to take some of the ideas that were espoused by the Enlightenment, things like equality, and begin to demand and challenge some of these gender norms that separate men and women at home and in society. In response to these changes, you have a lot of new ideas. Maybe one of the more important ones were the ideas put forward by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. And his idea was essentially that free market, laissez-faire capitalism was the best way for economic systems to be organized. This fundamentally challenged mercantilism, which stated that governments should try and accumulate the most amount of wealth as possible. Mercantilism limited trade between countries. Instead, Adam Smith said that government should not intervene in the economy and should allow for buyers and producers to, meet each other at a reasonable price. He called this approach the invisible hand. That supply would meet demand if you just didn't intervene at all, and that was not something that nations had believed in previously. And so free market capitalism says you're able to trade with whoever you want. And what you'll find is a lot of the institutions that make capitalism possible, like banks and joint stock companies are just going to become corporations, and corporations become the primary means in which these large industrial production facilities are raise capital and are constructed. So those ideas by Adam Smith will, in some ways, still shape the world and the economy that we live in today. Other people like Thomas Malthus looked at the population boom and simply said that the population was growing far too rapidly, especially among the lower classes of society, that overcrowding might become a problem in the future. And perhaps the most significant ideas that challenge this new industrial system are going to come by Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is going to articulate a philosophy, an ideology known as communism. And so what Karl Marx says, he looks at the changes that are taking place in society, and one of the fundamental changes is the changing of classes. So previously you had the three estates, those who pray, those who fight, and everybody else. We already know that in the everybody else category, the merchants were beginning to challenge those two other classes. Well, Karl Marx says that in this new industrial system, you only have two classes, right? Two estates essentially, but two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the ones that own the factories. Proletariat are the ones that work in the factories. And so because you have society dividing in these two camps, and that's it, and the more industrial society got, Marx said that the further that it would divide into these two classes, you're going to inevitably have class struggle, right? Workers versus the owners. And Karl Marx says that the proletariat, or the workers, the people who work long hours in dangerous conditions with low wages, they're going to be exploited to the point where they revolt against the bourgeoisie. And so in the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx envisions a proletariat revolution using terms like, once the proletariat have nothing to lose besides the chains that bind them, and you'll usher in a new utopian society in which there will be no class differences and everybody is equal. Now, these ideas, we'll talk about them again, but these ideas about class struggle and communist revolution are going to be greatly influential in the the next century or two. Now, workers did take charge of their own lives and did try to solve some of the problems that were presented by this new industrial system. Some examples are the Luddites. The Luddites were artisans or hand-skilled workers. They made things with their hands, shoemakers and stuff like that. For artisans, the Industrial Revolution meant that they were out of business because, if you're a shoemaker and you make them with your hands and the shoe factory opens up, right down the road, the shoe factory can make shoes 10 times cheaper, 10 times better, and 10 times faster. So as an artisan, you're out of luck. The Luddites, they were artisans. Their response was try to destroy all the factories. This wasn't practical in the long run, but it demonstrated to you some of the ways that people were trying to make sense of this different world. You have people like Robert Owen, who tried to establish utopian communities. Robert Owen believes he can create a factory system in which workers are paid a decent wage. Children go to daycare instead of working in the factories. People work decent hours. And, you take what you need and you kind of leave everything to the rest, that you didn't have to exploit your workers. Some of Owen's experiments are going to be successful and some of Owen's experiments are going to fail. Chartism, a political movement that sought to give workers more say in the political process in Great Britain. In Great Britain, to have a voice in Parliament, you had to own a certain amount of land. And because more and more people were moving into cities and becoming factory workers, that wasn't the case. Trade unions. Unions are workers that come together in order to get higher wages, safer working conditions, shorter hours. Trade unions and labor unions are going to pop up all over the world and try to fight for workers' rights. And then finally, you begin to see the government respond to some of these, problems. So examples are in Great Britain, the Factory Act of 1833 and the Mines Act of 1842. Both of these laws help to improve the conditions for some of the workers, although it takes some time for these laws and reforms to happen. Now, one last thing is to talk about industrialization outside of the West, because the Industrial Revolution happens in Great Britain. It spreads pretty early to the United States, and it spreads pretty early to Western and Northern Europe. But outside of that, industrialization is going to be a much slower process. And so when we look at places outside of Europe, India and China, we can see that industrialization has an uneven effect. So in India, it was true, the British East India Company was trading in India, and at first for empires like the Mughal Empire, the British were valuable trading partners, but also became threats to the Mughals because they traded oftentimes with locals that didn't agree with Mughal rule. But when the British East India Company begins to show up, or when the British East India Company shows up on the shores of India with cotton that is 90% cheaper, textiles that are 90% cheaper, they put local Indian cotton merchants and textile merchants out of business. And rather than India developing its own industrial system, you have India become a producer of raw materials. Now, the British East India Company are going to increasingly encroach in India, build railroads, build telegraphs, but will transform India into a raw material producing nation where India provides the cotton, it's shipped to Great Britain, Britain produces the final material and then gets to profit from that production. In China, you have somewhat of a similar situation. China also does not industrialize quickly. China lacks, it doesn't have some of the things that made industrialization possible. It doesn't have a lot of navigable rivers. It doesn't have a lot of canals. It doesn't have a lot of coastline that allows you to easily facilitate trade goods. It's a society that is mostly agrarian, peasants, labor. There's not a lot of cities. And it's a society in which, Confucianism and social harmony is most important. One important difference is that in China, there's inexpensive labor. This is also one of the reasons why you don't find industrialization in slave societies, because if you need something done, you don't need to build a machine to do it. You just need to get more slaves to do it. And so there was no need for machine technology. And by the time the British have steamships and ironclad ships, especially the British ship, the Nemesis, when it shows up on the shores of China, the China are absolutely no match. And we'll see when China and Great Britain go to war in the future that industrialization has given Great Britain the huge advantage.